Most people believe death is the end. It isn't. According to an ancient Tibetan text, death begins a sequence of events lasting exactly 49 days, a test unlike any other. We'll walk through three crucial phases: the moment of death, the bardo of visions, and the final choice, and reveal what to practice now so you aren't caught unprepared. This test doesn't involve angels or demons, but something much harder to face: your own mind turning against you. Most people fail not because they are weak, but because they don't recognize what's happening. The choice made in that moment decides whether you break free from rebirth or return again. If you care about meaning, suffering, and what you leave behind, this is the true test. And it all begins with a single light, brilliant, overwhelming, and the first moment most souls run from. Few people realize that the journey after death begins not with the quiet of a stopped heart or the final breath, but with light. Not a gentle brightness, but a radiance so overwhelming it erases everything familiar. Tibetan teachers call this the clear light. It is not a location, not an external guide, and not a vision. It's said to be the pure ground of awareness, stripped of all thought, image, and form. In that first instant after death, consciousness is described as expanding into something luminous, vast, and, for a brief moment, utterly free. Yet according to the texts, very few maintain it. Tibetan instructions describe this moment as an instant gateway to liberation if recognized. If one simply abides in that radiance, the cycle of repeating lives ends then and there. But almost no one does, because staying present in the light demands surrendering everything tied to identity. The problem is that minds are conditioned for grasping. Over the span of a lifetime, consciousness attaches itself to roles, memories, unfinished desires, anything that maintains the feeling of a stable self. When those boundaries suddenly dissolve, instinct recoils. Instead of relaxing into openness, fear ignites. It feels like annihilation. The reflex to cling to what is familiar, no matter how small, triumphs over the possibility of freedom. It might seem easy in theory to say one would surrender, but life's daily habits reveal how difficult it truly is. Consider how hard it can be to sit in simple silence. A few moments in a quiet room often push people toward their phones, music, or any small distraction. If that level of stillness is unsettling now, what will happen when faced with an openness as total as the clear light? It becomes clear why the reflex to grasp is so strong at death. This is why Tibetan masters describe the clear light as the first threshold. It is not a punishment nor a judgment from elsewhere. It is simply reality presenting itself in its most unfiltered form. Passing the threshold requires the skill of letting go. Yet most people live in ways that build the opposite habit. Daily patterns revolve around securing, holding, and reinforcing identity. That momentum does not pause at death, it carries straight through the threshold. The teachings stress that what happens in this single instant outweighs the years of life that came before. One clear recognition opens complete liberation. Missing it, however, sets everything else in motion. The point is not to wait until death to train for that moment, but to weave practice into life itself. Practice small acts of non-grasping, sit with silence, watch a craving arise and let it pass, so the reflexive clutching begins to lose its power. In this way, ordinary awareness becomes preparation. At death, the same habits continue. If one has worn the groove of letting go, recognition becomes more possible. Still, for most, fear takes hold. When the light appears, the mind resists, the radiance fades, and consciousness turns away. What follows next does not resemble silence, but something altogether stranger, an environment so vivid and immersive it feels indistinguishable from reality. When the light slips away, the mind doesn't rest. Something else begins to form, and it looks unbelievably real. If the first threshold confronts you with pure radiance, the next stage confronts you with your own mind turned outward. This is called the realm of illusions, the Bardo, the Tibetan word for the in-between state after death. Here, thought no longer stays contained inside. Each impulse, fear or hope unfolds into a scene, and the result feels astonishingly real. The mind stops acting like a private witness and instead becomes the very world it inhabits. At first, the visions appear gentle. Warm lights, soothing sounds, or even images of people you trusted may surround you. Some describe benevolent figures with radiant presence, or landscapes ordered and peaceful. They seem like rescue, protection, or blessing. But according to the texts, this is a trick of recognition. No forces have arrived from outside. Every beautiful form is your own mind trying to steady itself after losing the clear light. This shifting realm, part of the 49-day passage described in the texts, unfolds in stages. Yet reassurance cannot hold. The same vision that glowed with kindness a moment earlier can twist without warning. What felt like generosity can turn to cruelty when fear resurfaces. Gentle sounds sharpen into cries. Light grows jagged and strange. The more you resist or cling, the more these shapes sharden around you. Fear and desire feed the visions, giving them weight and form. That is the central rule of this stage. Resistance draws the horror closer, and grasping pulls the illusion tighter. Consider how guilt works in life. We bury it under explanations and distractions, pushing it out of awareness. But in the Bardo, what was hidden rises straight into view. Unresolved guilt takes shape as a figure that stalks you, pressing closer the more you run. Desire follows the same pattern. It paints entire realms of pleasure, feasts, wealth, intimate connections that shimmer like perfection. But touch them closely and they flicker, collapsing into emptiness, only to be rebuilt by craving all over again. Nothing comes from beyond. It is old habits given body, and the more energy poured into chasing or avoiding them, the stronger they stand. This is why Tibetan masters called the Bardo a battlefield made from memory and attachment. You are not meeting strangers here. You are facing your own life reflected back as landscape and presence. Every longing becomes a trap of beauty. Every fear becomes a figure of menace. Most people cannot see them for what they are, so they fall into believing in their permanence. The unsettling truth is that these mechanics are not unfamiliar. In life, fear casts ordinary shadows into looming threats. Desire paints opportunities as more than they are, leading to mistakes through overreaching. We already know small versions of this cycle. After death, the difference is scale. Here, those internal forces overwhelm perception entirely, producing whole environments in which you must live. The key is not to fight, but to recognize. The brilliant figure with compassionate features and the dark figure with terrifying form both arise from the same source, you. When this recognition dawns, their authority fades at once. They dissolve not because they were destroyed, but because they never existed apart from the mind to begin with. Awareness alone strips them of substance. Yet clarity is rare. Comforting images seduce, frightening shapes terrify, and most fall into grasping or running. Each act of clinging fuels desire. Each act of fear fuels threat. The illusions become more convincing until the self is swept deeper into the stream. Awareness alone offers escape, but few manage it consistently. And even for those who withstand these shifting visions, who refuse both the blissful scenes and the monstrous ones, The journey presses forward. The next stage is not outward at all. It moves inward with a bluntness that nothing can shield against. If you survive the storm of appearances, the next moment is even more intimate and far harder to deny. The next stage is known as the mirror of memory, a complete return of your entire lifetime, seen as if it were unfolding again. Imagine feeling not only what you once did, but also how others experienced it. A word spoken carelessly is felt exactly as the other person received it. The sting, the silence that followed, the weight it placed on them. This is not a vision in symbolic form, but an immediate reliving from every angle. According to the texts, this stage often arrives in the 3rd or 4th week of the 49-day interval. Unlike the shifting images of the Bardo, the mirror does not project landscapes or figures outside you. Instead, it exposes everything you once buried or justified. There is no judge, no tribunal, no cosmic ledger. The teaching stresses this. What takes place is not punishment from an outside deity, but an unavoidable self-witnessing. The only encounter is with your own life, woven through the lives of others. Acts of kindness return as living warmth. If you once offered shelter or calmed someone's fear, the relief they felt flows back through you in full force. But harm is equally precise. An insult or betrayal resounds in your awareness with the same sharpness it carried when first delivered. These are not abstractions or stories retold. They are lived sensations coursing back as if the roles have reversed. This intensity closes off the escape routes people depend on in life. Excuses and reframing collapse when the memory itself transmits the raw experience of everyone it touched. Denial no longer functions because the moment returns with a clarity sharper than the original. The mind cannot argue against what it inhabits directly. The impact is described as overwhelming. It is not a linear replay, but a total immersion in the weight of cause and effect. Small moments, easily forgotten while alive, swell with undeniable presence. A helping hand extended without thought, a sharp remark made in irritation, all surge back, magnified through the consciousness of those who received them. Both the comfort and the damage stand equal in intensity. You become the one who created and the one who received at the same time. This self-witnessing shapes what follows. The mind responds not with neutral observation, but with attraction and aversion. If cruelty dominates the review, the current of the mind bends toward futures in which cruelty persists. If compassion recurs, the gravitational pull heads in another direction. In this way, the pattern of the next existence grows out of what is faced in this review. In other words, how you treat others matters now, not later, because those effects will meet you. Preparation, then, becomes the central question. In ordinary life, people protect themselves from responsibility through distraction, screens, work, entertainment, anything to keep the conscience quiet. That habit makes the review unbearable because here nothing can be avoided. Daily avoidance trains the mind to resist its own record. The Tibetan teaching warns that this resistance does not dissolve with death. It only deepens the shock when avoidance collapses all at once. The mirror of memory is therefore not a moral lecture, but a direct consequence of living in a world of interconnection. Every action, however small, leaves an imprint. When uncovered, those imprints flood back through the own who set them in motion. The experience reshapes consciousness, preparing it for the next stage whether or not one is ready. Once stripped bare by memory, consciousness faces one last, irresistible pull, decision or drift. At the close of the Bardo journey, the final stage arises, the point often called the last decision, the final choice between returning or breaking free. By now the brilliance of the clear light has faded. The shifting illusions have been weathered. The full mirror of memory has left nothing hidden. What comes next looks gentler, almost welcoming. The frightening forms soften, giving way to scenes that feel strangely personal. A doorway opens onto a familiar house. A warm landscape appears, echoing childhood or home. These are not random images, but carefully tuned lures, visions designed to invite consciousness back into form. The teachings describe this pull as karmic attraction, past habits and desires acting like a hidden gravity. Each tendency seeded through a lifetime shapes the visions that appear here. If a person struggled with anger, the scenes may shimmer with intensity and struggle, resonating with that pattern. If compassion guided their actions, then the visions lean toward nurturing or peaceful landscapes. But in both cases, the mechanism is the same. The momentum of attraction urges consciousness forward toward another birth. The danger lies in mistaking this attraction for rescue, when in fact it is only continuation. Texts describe the experience as irresistible, not because fate closes the door, but because habit has been practiced for so long. The mind leans toward comfort, or what feels familiar, in the same way it leans in daily life. Just as someone reaches for distraction when feeling uneasy, here consciousness reaches for whatever scene promises safety. It is not a conscious choice of reincarnation, it is the flow of habit carrying forward. This is why it so often feels automatic, why most return without realizing they could have remained free. A single vivid image is used to describe this process: the moth flying into a flame. The moth does not analyze or decide. It follows light as if it promises shelter, unaware of the cost. In the same way, attraction here feels like a return to warmth. But the result is binding, not liberation. And just as the moth cannot blame the flame, these texts emphasize that no external power forces return. Conditioning itself completes the cycle. Still, this does not mean the outcome is fixed. The difference lies in recognition. If attraction is seen as a lure rather than a refuge, vision collapses at once. Those who can hold steady, refusing to indulge or recoil, dissolve the scene altogether. At that instant, the hidden gravity loses its pull. Liberation in this stage requires no struggle or conquest, only the clarity to refrain from chasing what seems comforting. The implication is that training cannot begin at the moment of death. Patterns decide in an instant, which is why daily rehearsal matters. Each small act of pausing, of not chasing the easy distraction or comforting memory, builds the capacity needed to withstand this final pull. In ordinary life, notice the very first impulse toward comfort or nostalgia and pause for 5 breaths. This tiny familiarity trains the same muscle needed here. Over years, such practice bends momentum in a different direction, preparing awareness to meet attraction without being fooled by it. Tibetan masters warn that almost no one makes this recognition without prior training. To die unprepared is to arrive at this stage with habits still in control. To die prepared is to meet the same visions with steadiness. In either case, the visions are not punishment or reward. They are mirrors of the tendencies lived each day. And so the final choice is never isolated from life. It is the flowering of all the choices made before. When this last threshold opens, most are carried into another body, another form, another lifetime. A few dissolve the attraction completely, stepping outside the cycle. Both paths are written into the teachings, but what is rarely remembered is that for centuries this knowledge was not openly shared. It was whispered, hidden, and restricted to those considered ready, for reasons more complex than superstition. Before uncovering why, pause here. Right now, Notice 3 attachments you would carry with you if death came tonight. Name them silently. The question then becomes, why would teachings about freedom itself be kept secret for so long? For centuries, the instructions found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead were treated with caution, copied by hand, and passed quietly among select students. They were never viewed as everyday teaching. The reason was not simple secrecy for its own sake, but concern about how the material could affect those unprepared for its depth. Masters feared that if revealed too early, people might respond with fear, confusion, or obsessive focus on the imagery instead of grasping the intended practice. Mishandled, the teachings could reinforce attachment rather than break it. Knowledge that aims directly at the mind structure was considered too precise to be used carelessly. There was also a broader concern shaped by the societies in which these texts appeared. Historical accounts suggest masters understood that these teachings shift responsibility inward onto the individual, rather than locating salvation in ritual or external authority. Some scholars note that releasing such ideas widely could disrupt established systems rooted in ritual compliance and obedience. The core radical idea, liberation, depends on individual awareness, not ritual performance. That message stood in quiet contrast to systems where authority relied on promising rewards or threatening consequences after death. Seen in that light, the choice to keep the text restricted had both personal and social dimensions. Personally, it protected students from misusing or misunderstanding practices that deal directly with death, fear, and identity itself. Socially, it prevented sudden upheaval by ensuring that the message, so different from the dominant religious frameworks of judgment and external control, did not spread into settings where it might destabilize belief structures too quickly. Rather than presenting this as a conspiracy, it can be understood as a careful balance. Advanced students could be trained gradually, while wider society remained within the systems that gave it order and coherence. This is what made the instructions unusual for their time. Where common patterns of religion emphasized obedience, ritual, and mediation through priests or institutions, here the emphasis was radical in its simplicity. Responsibility did not rest anywhere but within individual awareness itself. Awareness at death was the deciding factor, independent of how well one had served external structures in life. It is easy to see why such an idea would be considered disruptive in a context where social order often required framing life and death in terms of ritual compliance. The intended payoff of this hidden knowledge was freedom from fear. When no imagined judge dictates punishment or reward, fear no longer controls behavior as easily. This does not mean the instructions dismiss moral responsibility. On the contrary, they say responsibility is absolute, because the effects of one's actions and awareness return directly in death. But it reframes accountability away from ritual performance and places it squarely in lived awareness. This change in perspective challenges not only an individual's habits, but also the mechanisms by which societies guide behavior through fear of the afterlife. Today, echoes of these hidden instructions appear in places far removed from their original setting. Modern near-death reports and some consciousness researchers describe recurring themes that sound familiar: intense light, life review, the sense of judgment coming from within rather than without. Science has not offered definitive answers to these parallels, yet the resonance remains striking. Even without certainty, such experiences reopen questions about what happens at the boundary between life and death, and whether awareness itself extends further than the brain alone. For institutions, the risk remains what it has always been: A person who sees fear as projection is less vulnerable to control by fear. Someone who recognizes desire as binding is less pulled by endless consumption. And someone who believes awareness itself is decisive may no longer hand over authority unquestioned. These implications explain why such teachings were once restricted, not because they were mystical curiosities, but because they carried practical consequences for how people relate to power, belief, and control. What persists across centuries is the same caution: this knowledge alters responsibility. It places the burden and the freedom on personal awareness. For those ready to take that seriously, the secrecy has less to do with keeping others out, and more to do with making sure the ground is prepared before stepping into terrain where there is no turning back. And that leads to its most practical point. These teachings are not only about a hidden manual for what comes after death. Their relevance lies in this very moment. If illusions, fear, and desire shape the landscapes you will meet, then every day is training. Awareness is rehearsed in how you respond to distraction, to fear, to craving now. And that's why the teachings focus on what you can do now. Practice awareness so the moment of death reveals what you already trained for. Death does not transform us. It reveals what has already been shaped through living. Every fear avoided, every desire chased, every moment of presence or distraction builds patterns that appear again when the body is gone. The thresholds, light, illusions, memory, choice, mirror nothing more than the habits carried day by day. Life itself has always been the preparation. To meet that moment with steadiness, 3 practices stand out: detachment, letting go of small comforts; awareness, setting time to observe the mind without distraction; and acceptance, sitting with discomfort instead of fleeing. Each is a rehearsal for freedom. You don't need to wait until the end to practice freedom. Start now. If this resonated, tell us one attachment you'd like to loosen in the comments, and subscribe if you want more teachings that turn ancient maps into daily practice.